Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there is this comforting expectation of absolute precision.
Right, it's very binary.
Exactly. It's like engineering. You break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line on the glowing screen, and the doctor just points and says, there it is, that's the problem, and here is exactly how we fix it.
Yeah, you are either broken or you aren't.
Yeah.
And the protocol to get back to normal is mapped out in a textbook somewhere. We really crave that kind of certainty. We like things to be categorized neatly.
We do. But then you step into the world of human psychology and money, and suddenly it's like someone has taken a sledgehammer to that x-ray machine.
Oh, totally shattered it.
Right. We are looking at a landscape of decision-making that is murky, it's incredibly emotional, and honestly full of flat-out contradictions. So we are setting up a really tantalizing contradiction right out of the gate for you today. Why do the people who know the absolutely most about money rarely follow their own textbook advice?
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. And our mission in this deep dive is to explore the profound psychology of how we actually handle our money as opposed to how we are supposedly supposed to handle it.
Because the two are rarely the same.
Exactly. So we're unpacking a really fascinating set of sources today that blend this deeply personal financial philosophy with a sweeping, 75-year economic history of the post-World War II era.
It's a massive timeline.
It really is. We're going to start by looking closely at a single investor's personal confessions about their own portfolio, and then we're going to zoom way, way out. We're going to travel back through time to uncover exactly why you, me, and the modern American consumer at large are practically wired for financial stress.
Just wired for it from the moment we enter the economy. I cannot wait to get into this. Because we always assume financial decisions are these, cold, calculating, spreadsheet-driven things.
Right, we think it's all math.
Yeah. We think it's all about maximizing returns and finding the optimal mathematical path. But our source text completely shatters that illusion. Okay, let's unpack this. Our material introduces us to a billionaire investor named Sandy Gottesman.
He founded First Manhattan, right?
Yes, a highly successful consulting and investment group.
Yeah.
And when he is interviewing candidates for his investment team, and we are talking about high-level, brilliant finance people here, he is known to ask just one single interview question.
And it's not what you'd expect.
Not at all. He doesn't ask, what stocks do you think are cheap right now? He doesn't ask them to model out the global economy or predict the next recession.
No, the question is astonishingly simple, but just cuts right to the bone. Gottesman asks, what do you own and why?
Just show me what you actually do with your own money behind closed doors.
Exactly. Just lay out your actual portfolio. And the author of our source text notes that this is the ultimate question because it illuminates what can often be a mile-wide gap between what makes sense, which is what the textbook suggests you do, and what actually feels right to a human being.
Which is what they actually end up doing with their own livelihood.
Right. It exposes the massive chasm between being rational and being reasonable.
Rational versus reasonable. That is such a huge distinction. And to really drive home how wide that chasm is, the text hits us with a Morningstar statistic that honestly, it made my jaw drop the first time I read it.
Oh, the mutual fund stat. It's wild.
It is staggering. Half of all U.S. mutual fund portfolio managers do not invest a single cent of their own money in their own funds. Half.
$0 of their own money.
Just imagine that for a second. Imagine you secure a reservation at a 3-Michelin-star restaurant.
Okay, I'm tracking with you.
The executive chef comes out to your table, enthusiastically walks you through this intricate 20-course tasting menu they have designed. They pitch it as the absolute pinnacle of culinary achievement, right? A perfect symphony of flavors.
So delicious.
Right. But then at the end of the night, you walk around the alley and see that same chef sneaking out the back door, going home, and making themselves a completely plain, uninspired grilled cheese sandwich.
They refuse to eat their own cooking.
Exactly. At first glance, you look at that and think, well, that is just pure, unadulterated hypocrisy. I mean, if the fund is so great, why aren't they putting their own retirement money in it?
What's fascinating here is that the author argues we really shouldn't be so quick to label this as hypocrisy.
Really? How else do you explain it?
Well, it is actually a very common phenomenon across highly specialized, high-stakes professions. The text brings in this brilliant parallel to the medical field to explain the psychology at play.
Oh, the essay by Dr. Ken Murray.
Yes, from 2011. He's a clinical assistant professor of family medicine at USC, and he wrote this piece titled, How Doctors Die.
It's a heavy title.
It is. And the core thesis of that essay is showing the staggering degree to which doctors choose completely different end-of-life treatments for themselves than the treatments they routinely recommend for their own patients.
The quote from that section is chilling, but also deeply profound. Dr. Murray writes that doctors, quote, don't die like the rest of us.
Yeah.
He points out that they know exactly what is going to happen, they know the statistical probabilities of every choice, and they generally have access to any sort of advanced medical care they could possibly want. But when it comes to their own mortality, they go gently.
They step back from the aggressive interventions.
Right. A doctor might prescribe the absolute kitchen sink for a patient's cancer brutal rounds of chemotherapy, intense radiation, highly experimental and invasive surgeries, but when they get the exact same diagnosis themselves, they overwhelmingly choose palliative care. They choose to manage the pain and just stay home.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture of money, the synthesis is that when you are dealing with highly emotional, deeply complex issues, whether that is the existential dread of your own mortality, the well-being of your family, or the security of your life savings, the rational textbook answer often fails completely to check the emotional boxes required for peace of mind.
The emotional boxes are totally different from the logical ones.
Exactly. The textbook might say the rational choice is to fight the cancer with a 1% chance of success using experimental surgery. The textbook might say the rational financial choice is to leverage your assets to the hilt to maximize your compound annual growth rate.
But humans aren't textbooks.
Right. The author makes a vital point. Important financial decisions are not made in textbooks. They are made at the dinner table. They're made at 2 a.m. while staring at the ceiling, trying to minimize the chance of disappointing a spouse or failing a child. You cannot encapsulate those deeply human fears and emotions in a bar chart or a mathematical formula.
So the chef eats the grilled cheese because after a grueling 14-hour shift of extreme cognitive load and pressure, they don't want complexity.
They just want comfort.
Exactly. They aren't trying to be, quote-unquote, right in a culinary sense. They're just trying to feel okay. Which leads us perfectly into the author's own deeply personal philosophy. We are shifting from this general philosophy of the muddy waters of money into the author's highly specific financial goal.
And it is not at all what you would expect from someone writing a finance book.
It really isn't. You expect a book on finance to be all about optimizing returns, beating the market, or accumulating the highest possible net worth.
But instead, the author introduces a quote from the legendary investor Charlie Munger, the late vice chairman of Berkshire Hathaway. Munger said, "I did not intend to get rich. I just wanted to get independent."
I just wanted to get independent. That is such a crucial distinction, and the author completely aligns their entire worldview with this concept.
Yeah, they write that chasing the absolute highest returns or using leverage to buy assets just to project a luxurious lifestyle holds absolutely zero interest for them.
In fact, they view those things as incredibly dangerous games.
Right, games that people play primarily to impress their peers, but which are full of hidden, catastrophic risks. For this author, true independence means waking up every single morning knowing that you and your family can do whatever you want to do on your own terms.
And to really understand why this author feels so fiercely about independence, the text dives into the story of the author's parents. It is this generational influence that permanently shaped this mindset.
It's a really grounding story. The author's parents lived their adult years in two very distinct, almost polarized stages.
Night and day.
Right. During the first stage, they were dirt poor. They were scraping by. Then in the second stage, they were moderately well off. And the turning point between those two eras was when the father finally became a doctor at the age of 40.
Now, starting a medical career at 40 is relatively late, especially when you consider that he already had 3 young children depending on him. Just imagine the sheer pressure of that scenario.
It's immense.
You have 3 kids, you are navigating the brutal gauntlet of medical school and residency, and you are doing it on a shoestring budget. You are forced to learn how to stretch every single dollar just to survive.
But here's the critical detail the text emphasizes. When he finally became a full-fledged doctor and that high salary started coming in, it did not override or erase the frugal mentality that had been hardwired into them during those lean years.
They didn't just suddenly start buying yachts.
Exactly. They had already mastered the art of living on very little. So when the big money finally arrived, they didn't inflate their lifestyle to match the income. They spent those peak earning years living dramatically below their means. They locked in an exceptionally high savings rate.
And we have to ask, what did that high savings rate actually buy them? Like you said, it didn't buy them a fleet of sports cars or a massive mansion. It bought them that exact Munger definition of independence.
The ability to walk away.
Yes. The father was an emergency room doctor. Now, for anyone listening, we know the ER is intense, but the text specifically highlights the physical toll it takes.
It's one of the highest stress professions imaginable.
Truly, it requires this physically agonizing toggling of circadian rhythms, bouncing constantly between day shifts, night shifts, and swing shifts. It actively degrades your health over time.
But because they maintained that frugal lifestyle and banked the difference, after 2 decades in the ER, the father reached a point where he simply had enough.
And he was able to just stop.
He quit. He walked away entirely on his own terms, without a second thought about the financial consequences, to move on to the next phase of his life.
The author says watching that happen left a permanent mark on them. Seeing that ability to wake up one morning, decide the current path is no longer serving you, and just change what you're doing without needing anyone's permission.
The author calls that the grandmother of all financial goals.
I love that phrase, the grandmother of all financial goals. It doesn't necessarily mean you stop working entirely and sit on a beach sipping margaritas. It just means you only do the work you actually want to do with people you actually respect at the times you prefer for as long as you want.
It is total autonomy.
Total autonomy. And the profound realization the author had was that you don't actually need a doctor's salary to achieve that autonomy.
No, it is mostly a matter of keeping your expectations in check. Past a certain baseline level of income, once your basic needs are met, your savings rate is driven almost entirely by your ability to keep your lifestyle expectations from running away from you.
Which brings us to how the author and their spouse actually executed this in their own lives. They figured out how to stop what they call the moving goalpost.
This is such a hard thing to do in practice.
It really is. The text explains that they met in college, they graduated, they got entry-level jobs with standard entry-level pay, and they settled into what they considered a very moderate baseline lifestyle.
All right, they had a decent apartment, they drove decent, reliable cars, they ate decent food. It was comfortable, but nothing fancy.
And then the years went by. Over the next decade, both of their incomes rose significantly. The author was building a successful career in finance, and the spouse was advancing in healthcare.
But here is the kicker. They just stayed there.
They deliberately kept their lifestyle pegged exactly where it was in their 20s. Virtually every single dollar of every raise, every bonus, every promotion they ever got just went straight into what they call their independence fund.
Every extra dollar.
Okay, but let me pause and push back on this for a second. Let's really scrutinize this, because it sounds incredibly noble on paper, but isn't it just fundamental human nature to upgrade your life when you get a raise?
Oh, absolutely it is.
I mean, you work 80-hour weeks, you grind. You finally get that promotion, you biologically want the reward. You want the nicer car with the leather seats. You want to move to the zip code with the better schools. You want to take the vacation that doesn't involve a budget airline.
It's the classic lifestyle creep.
Exactly. So how do you actually avoid feeling completely deprived and miserable when you know for a fact you have the cash sitting in your bank account to buy those luxury items, but you deliberately choose to just sit in your perfectly average apartment? Doesn't that just feel like you are punishing yourself?
That is a very fair challenge, and it's the exact friction point where most people's financial plans completely fall apart.
Right.
But the text actually addresses this head on. The author freely admits that this extreme approach would absolutely not work for everyone. It only works for them because of 2 very specific, non-negotiable reasons.
Okay, what are they?
First, both spouses agreed to it equally. This is paramount. Neither one is compromising their core desires for the other. They are entirely on the same page.
That makes sense. If one partner desperately wanted the luxury cars and the country club and the other wanted extreme frugality, it would just be a breeding ground for deep resentment.
It would destroy the marriage. But secondly, and perhaps more fundamentally, they genuinely derive their highest psychological pleasure from low-cost activities. They like going for long walks. They like reading books. They like listening to deep-dive conversations like ours.
They just don't crave the expensive stuff.
Exactly. Because their internal aspirations for accumulating more quote-unquote stuff simply haven't moved. They rarely, if ever, feel repressively frugal.
They successfully got the goalpost of their own lifestyle desires to just stop moving.
Precisely. The goalpost is anchored in cement. And the author quotes the statistician and essayist Nassim Taleb here, which perfectly encapsulates the underlying psychology.
What's the quote?
Taleb wrote, "True success is exiting some rat race to modulate one's activities for peace of mind."
Modulate one's activities for peace of mind.
Think about that phrase. By keeping their lifestyle consistently below what their balance sheet says they can afford, they completely strip away the tremendous, exhausting social pressure of keeping up with the Joneses.
Which is a massive invisible burden that so many people carry every day without even realizing it's crushing them. So they have established this extreme psychological comfort zone. And here's where it gets really interesting.
Oh yeah, the portfolio details.
Right, because when you look at how they actually invest this massive independence fund they've built up, they do things that would make a traditional, mathematically driven financial advisor pull their hair out. They enthusiastically defend what, on a spreadsheet, looks like an entirely indefensible portfolio.
Yes. This is where that gap between rational and reasonable moves from a philosophical concept into very tangible dollars and cents decisions. Let's look at their first major financial asset, their home.
Okay.
The author owns their house entirely outright, no mortgage whatsoever. Now, the text explicitly notes that they bought this house during a period when interest rates were absurdly low.
Right. And any fiduciary financial advisor worth their salt would look at that and scream, "What are you doing? Money is practically free."
It makes no sense on paper.
The textbook advice is obvious. Take out a 30-year mortgage at that rock-bottom low rate. Take all that hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash you would have put into the house and invest it in the stock market.
Let it grow.
Exactly. Historically, the stock market returns 7, 8, 9% over the long haul. Your mortgage is costing you maybe 3%. You pocket the difference. Mathematically, paying off the house with cash is leaving massive amounts of money on the table. It is objectively the wrong financial decision.
And the author completely, 100% agrees with the math. They openly acknowledge it is the worst financial decision they have ever made on paper.
But they still did it.
But, and this is the crux of their entire philosophy, they also call it the best money decision they have ever made.
What?
The synthesis here is that the author is actively, consciously choosing psychology over mathematics. The deeply independent, secure feeling they get from waking up in a house knowing they own the roof over their heads outright far exceeds the known calculable financial gain of leveraging their assets with a cheap mortgage.
It's about how it feels.
Yes, eliminating that monthly payment, completely removing the bank from their living situation, simply feels better to them than maximizing long-term net worth. As the author says at some point, you have to choose between being happy and being right.
Choosing to be happy over being right. I love that framing. And they don't stop with the house. The text reveals they also keep a massive 20% cash cushion.
20%, that's huge.
20% of all their non-housing assets are just sitting in cold, hard cash. Now, let me push back on this again because this feels even more egregious than the mortgage.
Go for it.
If inflation is running at 3, 4, or even 7%, like we've seen recently, holding 20% in cash isn't just a neutral, safe decision. It is an active penalty. You are mathematically guaranteeing a massive loss of purchasing power every single year.
You're losing money by holding it.
You are essentially setting a small pile of money on fire just to, quote-unquote, feel safe. How on earth can the author reconcile that as a reasonable approach?
It's a great question, and it speaks to the hidden premiums we pay for psychological comfort. The author justifies this by calling cash the oxygen of independence.
The oxygen of independence, what does that actually mean in practice?
It means that keeping that much cash acts as an impenetrable shield. It ensures that they never ever have to be forced into selling the stocks they own when life inevitably throws a brutal, unpredictable curveball.
Ah, I see.
And life will throw curveballs. A sudden medical emergency, a prolonged job loss, a global pandemic that shocks the economy. The author notes that people always ask them, what are you saving all this cash for? Are you buying a boat, a vacation home, a new car?
And what do they say?
The answer is always no. They are not saving for a specific purchase. They are saving for a world where unexpected expenses are a guaranteed feature, not a bug.
Right, emergencies are going to happen.
By having that massive cash buffer, they don't have to interrupt the compounding growth of their stock portfolio to pay for an emergency. This brings us back to another Charlie Munger quote from the text. The first rule of compounding is to never interrupt it unnecessarily.
That is so smart.
They view the inflation drag on their cash not as money set on fire, but as an insurance premium they gladly pay to protect the compounding engine of their investments.
So the cash is literally a psychological moat that protects the investment strategy from human panic. Speaking of which, let's look at what is actually inside that investment strategy.
Right, what are they actually buying?
The author confesses that back in their 20s, they used to be an active stock picker. They owned something like 25 individual stocks. They were digging into balance sheets, doing deep value investing, buying big names like Berkshire Hathaway and Procter and Gamble. They were actively trying to beat the market average.
But their philosophy evolves. Today, the text notes their portfolio is 100% low-cost index funds. Just a dead simple combination of U.S. and international stocks. No individual picking, no trying to outsmart the market.
And the reason why they made that switch is rooted in a pretty brutal statistical reality that the text provides.
The failure rate of the pros.
Exactly. The author points out that 85% of large-cap active fund managers, and we are talking about the absolute professionals here, the people on Wall Street whose entire waking life is dedicated to picking winning stocks, who have teams of analysts and supercomputers, 85% of them failed to beat the standard S&P 500 over the decade ending in 2019.
That is a staggering failure rate for a profession that charges high fees for its expertise.
It's wild.
The author doesn't claim it is completely impossible to beat the market, but they argue that for the vast majority of people, systematically dollar-cost averaging into a low-cost index fund provides the absolute highest probability of long-term success.
Just keeping it simple.
And here's how it ties back to their lifestyle. Because their lifestyle is so frugal, because they have that fixed goalpost we talked about, they simply don't need to take the added risk of trying to beat the market to reach their financial goals.
They don't need the massive home runs.
Exactly. They rely on a very simple triad for success: a remarkably high savings rate, relentless patience, and a fundamental optimism that the global economy will continue to create value over the next several decades. For them, everything else is just noise.
So we have this incredibly vivid picture of an individual who has completely opted out of the modern financial rat race. They live well below their means, they hoard cash for the pure peace of mind, they buy boring index funds, and they sleep soundly at night.
It sounds incredibly peaceful.
It really does. But let's be honest with ourselves and with everyone listening. For the average person, opting out sounds great, but actually ignoring what your neighbors are doing, ignoring the cars pulling into the driveways next door, it feels biologically impossible today. Why is it so overwhelmingly difficult for us to just be satisfied with what we have?
And that is the billion-dollar question. To answer that, the source text tells us we have to pivot. We have to transition from the micro-behavior of this one individual author and look at the macro history of the United States.
We have to zoom way out.
Because it's not just a personal failing that we feel this way. We have been uniquely systemically conditioned to compete. To truly understand why your brain is practically wired to panic when your neighbor gets a new car, we actually have to travel back to a very specific, pivotal moment in time, August 1945.
Okay, let's set the scene for you, the listener. Imagine you are living in August 1945. World War II finally ends. Japan surrenders. The New York Times literally runs the headline, "The happiest day in American history."
The relief is just unimaginable.
But almost immediately, the very next morning, that immense joy is met with absolute paralyzing post-war terror. Because you have 16 million Americans, that is 11% of the entire U.S. population, with an average age of just 23 years old, who are suddenly packing up their gear and coming home.
11% of the country.
And they are all looking around, asking the exact same terrifying questions. What happens now? Where are we going to work? Where are we going to live?
The fear was incredibly palpable, and it was rooted in very recent, very deep trauma. We have to remember that the Great Depression had only officially ended roughly 5 years prior to the start of the war.
Right, it was fresh in everyone's minds.
The immediate, terrifying assumption among economists and politicians was that without the massive government-funded war machine propping up the factories and employment lines, the country would plunge right back into the devastating depths of a depression.
And the situation on the ground for a returning 23-year-old veteran was incredibly bleak. Housing construction had completely ground to a halt during the war because all the lumber, all the steel, all the labor was diverted to building tanks and planes and ships.
Everything went to the war effort.
In 1943, fewer than 12,000 homes were built per month in the entire country. So you have millions of soldiers coming back to a severe, unprecedented housing shortage. On top of that, the marriage rate was spiking astronomically.
Well, yeah, they wanted to start their lives.
These young veterans had just survived the worst, most brutal conflict in human history. They did not want to come home and sleep in a cot in their mother's basements. They wanted to start their lives and their families immediately.
Meanwhile, the jobs they held before they deployed, or the jobs that were artificially created on the home front to build war supplies, vanished overnight.
The factory shut down.
Right. The text points out that the Council of Economic Advisors actually delivered a formal report to President Truman in 1946, explicitly warning of, quote, a full-scale depression sometime in the next 1 to 4 years. They were terrified of a deflationary downward spiral where no one had jobs, no one bought goods, and the economy collapsed in on itself again.
So what does the government do? They couldn't rely on exporting goods to rebuild the economy because Europe and Japan were quite literally reduced to rubble. There was no one to sell to. So they created a massive diplomatic policy response.
And this is the turning point.
This is the exact intentional birth of the American consumer as we know it today.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the government made an explicit, calculated pivot in the national psyche. During the war years, the prevailing culture was all about extreme thrift. It was about saving your pennies, buying war bonds, rationing your meat and gasoline, and making immense personal sacrifices to support the troops.
It was unpatriotic to consume.
But after 1945, the government realized they needed the exact opposite. Consumption suddenly became an explicit, patriotic economic strategy to save the nation from depression.
They needed people to spend money, and they needed them to do it fast. So to grease the wheels, they made borrowing money cheaper than it had almost ever been in history. The Federal Reserve, which the text notes wasn't fully politically independent back then, had already capped short-term interest rates at a microscopic 0.38% to help finance the war effort.
And they just kept them there.
They held rates artificially at the floor for 7 years.
And then came the masterstroke of policy, the GI Bill. This legislation offered unprecedented mortgage opportunities to those 16 million returning veterans. We are talking about the ability to buy a home with absolute zero money down, no interest payments required in the first year, and fixed interest rates so incredibly low that a monthly mortgage payment on a new house could actually be significantly cheaper than renting a cramped apartment.
And it wasn't just limited to houses. The text notes that all the strict Depression-era credit regulations were completely loosened or dismantled. The very first credit card, the Diners Club card, was introduced in 1950.
The start of plastic.
Store credit, installment plans, personal loans, suddenly everything was available to everyone on credit. And get this, because this blew my mind. The interest on all that consumer debt, even high-interest credit cards, was completely tax-deductible at the time.
The government was practically begging you to take on debt,
incentivizing you to go into debt and buy stuff.
The resulting explosion of debt is staggering to look at. If you look at the raw data from that era, it's hard to wrap your head around how fast it shifted. In 1945, total U.S. household debt was roughly $29.4 billion. By 1955, just 10 years later, it had skyrocketed to $125.7 billion.
Wow, in just a decade.
To put that in perspective, household debt in the 1950s grew 1.5 times faster than it did during the notorious, reckless debt splurge of the 2000s that led to the Great Recession. The American spender was officially born.
And boy, did they spend. Which brings us into the 1950s, this era that is so often romanticized as the golden era of shared prosperity. Because all that frantic spending, fueled by this tidal wave of cheap debt, hit the economy at the exact same time as a massive hidden productivity boom was unleashed.
Yes, the text highlights a fascinating historical dynamic here.
Yeah.
The 1930s Great Depression was obviously a brutal period of suffering, but out of absolute dire necessity, it forced massive innovation. Companies had to figure out how to do more with less. They innovated rapidly.
Nobody noticed.
Right. Nobody really noticed those technological leaps at the time because they were just focused on surviving the breadlines. Then the 1940s came, and again, nobody noticed the innovations because all industrial capacity was entirely focused on winning a global war.
But then the 1950s roll around, the war is over, the factories retool, and suddenly all these incredible inventions that were pent up for 20 years are ready for the mass consumer market. We are talking about modern appliances, widespread air conditioning, reliable electricity grids, and televisions.
A total lifestyle upgrade.
And you combine that technological leap with all this pent-up demand from the returning soldiers who couldn't buy anything for half a decade.
The statistics the text provides to illustrate the sheer scale of this boom are incredible. From 1945 to 1949, Americans bought 21 million cars. 7 million new homes were built in that same 5-year window.
That is just explosive growth.
This explosive, insatiable demand for physical goods created millions of good-paying, secure manufacturing jobs for those returning veterans. They were paid well to build the stuff, which they then turned around and bought with their new government-subsidized credit. It was a perfect, closed-loop economic engine.
It was an absolute economic miracle. But the most defining characteristic of the 1950s, and this is the absolute most crucial point to understanding our modern psychology, is what the text calls the Great Leveling. The country didn't just get richer overall, it got rich by making the poor significantly less poor.
The gap shrank.
The economic gains of this boom were shared more equally across the population than perhaps at any other time in American history.
The numbers back this up beautifully. Average wages essentially doubled from 1940 to 1948, and then, incredibly, they doubled again by 1963. And the critical factor is that those massive wage gains were focused heavily on the working and middle classes.
What about the wealthy?
At the exact same time, the top 1% of earners actually saw their share of the total national income drop significantly, falling from 13% in 1945 down to just 7%. The gap between the richest and the poorest collapsed.
And it wasn't just white men benefiting from this tightening. The text points out that women's labor force participation rose steadily to 40% by 1965. Minorities were making noticeable, albeit slow, economic gains as well.
There's a great example of this in the text.
Yeah, there is this amazing quote from Eleanor Roosevelt that the text includes, observing the crowd at the 1945 presidential inauguration. She noted an African-American reporter telling her that if colored people had mixed with everyone else at a similar reception 12 years earlier, it would have been scandalous front-page news.
But in 1945...
But in 1945, it wasn't even mentioned in the papers. Now, we have to be clear, civil rights and equality were nowhere near what they are today, and segregation was still brutally enforced in many areas. But the economic trajectory, the overall momentum toward a leveled playing field, was undeniably pointing upward.
And this flattening of incomes led directly to a flattening of lifestyles. This is what sociologists call cultural synchronization. Because the income distribution was so incredibly tight, the vast majority of people lived lives that were very fathomable, very similar to those around them.
The text pulls this great quote from Harper's Magazine in 1957, pointing out that the rich man smoked the exact same brand of cigarettes as the poor man. They shaved with the exact same Gillette razors, they used the exact same rotary telephones, they watched the exact same television sets.
Even the cars, right.
Even the differences between a rich man's car and a poor man's car were relatively minor. Maybe the rich guy had slightly better leather seats and a bit more chrome, but it was essentially the same engine and the same chassis.
The essayist Paul Graham noted a fascinating point about media consumption during this time. Because there were only 3 major TV networks, tens of millions of American families were literally sitting down to watch the exact same shows, absorbing the exact same cultural messages at the exact same time every single night.
Okay, let's just pause and reflect on how powerful this is psychologically for you, the listener. If you are living in that era, you look out your window, you look at your neighbors across the street, you watch the characters on TV, and everyone is roughly in the exact same economic boat as you.
It creates a powerful baseline.
Everyone is taking a collective step forward together. It sets this incredibly deep, hardwired expectation in the American psyche of what is quote-unquote normal. Normal means equality of lifestyle. Normal means if the economy grows, the entire middle class thrives together. Normal means my life should look essentially like my neighbor's life.
It was a beautiful, unique moment in economic time. But there was a hidden, silent warning sign brewing beneath the surface of all those freshly manicured suburban lawns.
The debt.
We mentioned the massive debt expansion earlier. Between 1947 and 1957, household debt grew 5-fold. Homeownership jumped from 47% to 62% by 1970.
A massive, unprecedented debt boom. But here's the crucial point the text makes. It didn't hurt them at the time. The debt didn't crush them. Why? Because their incomes were surging rapidly right alongside the debt.
They could afford the payments easily.
And because they were starting from a baseline of almost zero debt after the forced austerity of the Depression and the war, it was mathematically manageable. It felt completely safe. And so a deep cultural acceptance that utilizing debt is a perfectly fine, completely normal way to fund your lifestyle took permanent root in the culture.
Which sets the stage perfectly for the paradigm shift. We move from the post-war boom into what the text profoundly calls the big stretch. Because as we move forward in time, the underlying reality of the economy changed drastically, but the psychological expectations cemented in the 1950s stayed exactly the same.
The structural cracks really begin to show in 1973. It was a brutal year for the American economy. Inflation surges out of nowhere and stays punishingly high. Short-term interest rates jump up to 8%. Unemployment hits its highest point since the 1930s.
The landscape totally shifted.
And suddenly, for the first time since the war, America isn't the only economic game in town anymore. The global landscape has rebuilt. Japan's manufacturing economy is booming and producing better, cheaper cars. China is beginning to open up its labor force. The Middle East is aggressively flexing its geopolitical power with oil embargoes. The easy, unencumbered tailwinds of the 50s and 60s simply died down.
But the U.S. economy didn't collapse entirely. It adapted, but it mutated. We moved into the 1980s and 1990s, the era of Ronald Reagan declaring it morning in America, and later Bill Clinton boasting of unprecedented economic expansion and a new economy driven by technology.
Right, the economy was technically growing again.
And to be fair, politicians weren't lying about the aggregate growth. Total real GDP growth in the 1990s was roughly 40%, which is actually nearly identical to the 42% growth seen during the boom of the 1950s. The pie was growing at the exact same speed.
So the pie is growing. But the twist, and this is a violent, society-altering twist, is that the distribution of that growth was totally, completely different. The text gives us this jaw-dropping statistic sourced from The Atlantic. Between 1993 and 2012, the top 1% of earners saw their real incomes grow by an astounding 86.1%.
That's a massive leap.
During that exact same two-decade period, the bottom 99% saw their incomes grow by just 6.6%.
It was the exact opposite of the Great Leveling. It was a massive historic divergence. The rich pulled away at light speed, and everyone else stagnated. But this is exactly where the psychological trap we've been talking about springs shut.
Right, the expectations.
The analysis here is that human expectations always move slower than economic facts. A massive generation of Americans have been raised with the post-war cultural expectation that they should be able to live a lifestyle relatively similar to their peers. That belief was hardwired into them by their parents and their childhood environment.
Right. The text introduces this brilliant, painful, hypothetical scenario to explain the mechanics of the big stretch. Let's look at two guys. Let's call the first one Joe. Joe is a high-level investment banker or a tech executive. He is riding the absolute crest of this new wave of the top 1%.
Okay, Joe's doing great.
He's making $900,000 a year. He buys a 4,000 square foot custom home. He has two brand new Mercedes parked in the driveway. He sends his kids to $50,000 a year private colleges. Now, mathematically, Joe can easily afford all of this. He has the cash flow.
And then we have our second guy, Peter. Peter is a solid middle management bank branch supervisor making $80,000 a year. Now, Peter looks at Joe, and because of the deep psychological expectations instilled in him by his parents from the 1950s, the idea of cultural synchronization, Peter feels a subconscious, almost biological sense of entitlement to live a lifestyle somewhat comparable to Joe's.
He expects it to be close.
Peter's entire worldview is built on the premise that in America, lifestyles aren't that different, even if the specific jobs are.
But Peter lives in a completely different mathematical reality than his parents did. His income simply hasn't grown like Joe's. It's barely kept up with inflation. So what does this all mean for Peter? How does he bridge that massive, glaring gap between his $80,000 reality and his $900,000 visual expectations?
Massive debt.
Massive debt.
To keep up the illusion, Peter takes out a huge adjustable rate mortgage he can barely afford to buy a house in a neighborhood he wants to be seen in. He racks up $45,000 in high-interest credit card debt, buying the same clothes and taking the same vacations as Joe.
He leases the luxury cars so they look identical in the driveway.
Exactly. His kids take on crushing student loans to go to the same private colleges. Peter is physically, emotionally, and financially stretching himself to the absolute breaking point just to maintain the visual illusion of that 1950s equality.
Think of it this way. Think of the 1950s economy like a group of people jogging side by side on a massive treadmill set to a comfortable, identical speed. Everyone is keeping pace, chatting, feeling good.
I like this analogy.
Then the 1980s and 90s hit, and the treadmill for the top 1% speeds up to an absolute sprint, while the treadmill for the bottom 99% stays in a moderate jog. But because of that hardwired 1950s expectation, you feel you must stay alongside the sprinters. It feels like a failure if you fall behind.
But your legs literally cannot move fast enough to keep up.
Exactly. Your stagnant wages can't keep pace. So what do? You start grabbing the handrails and dragging your body forward. That pulling, that desperate artificial leverage just to stay in the same visual position, that is debt. And eventually your arms are going to give out.
That is a phenomenal way to visualize the mechanism of the stretch. And the macro statistics of this era show an entire nation grabbing those handrails. The text points out that during this exact period where median wages were essentially flat against inflation, the median size of a new American home inexplicably grew by 50%.
It makes no sense unless you factor in the psychology.
We actually reached a bizarre point in the 2000s where the average new American home was built with more bathrooms than it had human occupants.
More toilets than people? It makes no logical sense unless you look at it through the lens of psychological keeping up. Adjusted for inflation, the average auto loan more than doubled between 1975 and 2003.
And then there's the debt-to-income ratio.
The most damning metric. For decades, it had stayed relatively flat at around 60%. But starting in the 80s, it just climbed and climbed, accelerating until it hit over 130% by 2007. And the burden of carrying all that leverage was incredibly heavy.
People were drowning in interest.
By the mid-2000s, lower-income groups were spending over 21% of their entire monthly income just servicing the interest on their debt payments.
Which inevitably brings us to the breaking point, 2008, the ultimate reckoning. The text references the late economist Hyman Minsky, who coined a financial concept that is now widely known as the Minsky moment.
The Minsky moment.
A Minsky moment happens when a financial system moves from speculative finance, where your income can at least cover the interest on your debt, to Ponzi finance, where your income can no longer even cover the interest, let alone the principal. You have to take on new debt just to pay the old debt.
That's cards.
It is the precise mathematical moment when the illusion breaks because the cash flow simply cannot service the leverage anymore.
The author describes it vividly as the Wile E. Coyote moment. You know, the classic cartoon. The coyote is chasing the roadrunner. He sprints right off the edge of the cliff, and his legs are just spinning in thin air.
And he's fine for a second.
For a few seconds, he's completely fine. The illusion holds. But then he finally stops, looks down, realizes there is absolutely no solid ground beneath him, and he plummets. That was the American consumer staring down at their balance sheet in 2008. The handrails of the treadmill finally broke.
In the aftermath, the policy hangover of the 2008 crash is what truly set the stage for our current era, because it only exacerbated the deep psychological frustrations. The government and the Federal Reserve had to orchestrate massive responses, things like quantitative easing, backstopping corporate debt markets, and eventually various tax cuts.
Now, the text notes these drastic measures may have been entirely necessary at a macro level to prevent a total catastrophic collapse of the global banking system.
But let's look at how those policies actually worked on the ground. Take quantitative easing, or QE. When the Fed does QE, they essentially create money to buy massive amounts of bonds from banks. This floods the financial system with cash and drives down interest rates.
And that cash has to go somewhere.
Right, it floods into the stock market and into real estate, driving asset prices sky high. Now, if you are wealthy and you already own a massive stock portfolio and multiple properties, you get immensely richer in your sleep. But if you are Peter, the guy living paycheck to paycheck with zero assets, you get absolutely none of that massive wealth windfall.
Exactly. The side effect of saving the system was that those policies heavily disproportionately favored the people who already owned capital assets. The gap widened even further, and it happened in plain sight.
The post-war expectation of a broad, equal middle class wasn't just fractured anymore, it was completely visibly shattered.
This brings us to a highly critical section of our deep dive today, focusing on what the author defines as the era of Stop the Ride. Now, before we unpack this specific segment, it is absolutely essential to state very clearly for you, the listener, that we are not taking any political sides here.
No. Strictly maintaining political impartiality.
We are merely reporting the author's economic thesis regarding the sociopolitical movements of the last 15 years, exactly as they are presented in the source text.
Yes, that is vital context. We are analyzing the underlying economic theory the author lays out, not endorsing a political platform. And the author asks a really poignant, almost counterintuitive question. If you look at a macroeconomic spreadsheet today, the economy is statistically doing quite well. Overall unemployment has been remarkably low, and recently, wages for the lowest income workers have actually been rising faster than inflation.
So why is everyone so visibly, viscerally angry?
This raises an important question indeed, because the mood does not match the data. The author's thesis is that people are angry because the system no longer feels meritocratic.
The 1950s ideal is dead.
The 1950s ideal of the shared American dream, where if you work hard, you buy a house, you raise a family, and you are equal to your peers, that specific reality is mathematically dead for many. But the deep culturally ingrained desire for it remains fully intact. You have 1950s expectations colliding with 2020's realities.
And so you see the symptoms of this profound discontent erupting everywhere across the spectrum. The author links together major populist events: the rise of the Tea Party, the Occupy Wall Street protests, the Brexit vote in the UK, and the election of Donald Trump.
Politically, the stated goals and ideologies of these movements are vastly, wildly different.
But economically, the author argues they all represent massive groups of people who are fundamentally shouting the exact same core sentiment: stop the riot, I want off! They are all looking at the established system and saying, this isn't working for me anymore.
The author writes that while the details of their shouting, the specific policies they demand, are different, they are driven by the exact same underlying feeling. I don't live in the world I expected. The world I was promised by my parents and my culture does not exist. That makes me incredibly angry. So I'm going to vote for or fight for something totally radically different.
It is a massive structural rejection of the status quo because the status quo entirely failed to deliver the 1950s expectations they felt entitled to.
And then you take that smoldering baseline of economic disappointment and you throw a tanker truck of gasoline on the fire. And the gasoline is the internet. The gasoline is modern social media.
Social media.
The text quotes the tech analyst Benedict Evans, who summarized this perfectly. He said, "The more the internet exposes people to new points of view, the angrier people get that different views exist." But it's not just about views, it's about lifestyles.
Let's compare that to the 1950s again. Back then, your social comparison group was your immediate physical neighbors. You watched the same 3 TV channels, which broadcast highly sanitized, homogenized versions of middle-class life.
The range of economic outcomes you visually witnessed on a daily basis was very narrow. You didn't know how the billionaires lived because you never saw them.
Today, the mechanism of comparison is hypercharged. Through Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and hyperpartisan cable news, you don't just see your neighbors. You see the top 0.1% flexing their immense wealth every single day, in high definition, right in the palm of your hand.
The algorithms are literally designed to curate and feed you images of the lifestyles you desire but cannot attain.
You are made keenly, painfully aware of exactly what you don't have every time you unlock your phone. It makes the psychological pain of the big stretch feel exponentially more agonizing because the gap isn't just a number on a page. It is shoved in your face 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
The era of "this isn't working" is firmly here, and according to the author's historical analysis, it might stick around for a very long while. Because, as we established, human expectations just move so much slower than economic reality. It takes generations to rewrite the cultural DNA.
Which brings us back full circle to the individual. To you listening to us right now, we have gone on this massive, sweeping journey today.
We really have.
We've seen how a specific policy decision made in August 1945, designed simply to stop a short-term post-war depression, accidentally engineered a 75-year cycle of hyperconsumerism, massive household debt, devastating lifestyle inflation, and eventually completely shattered societal expectations.
We have meticulously disassembled the macro machine that built the modern financial rat race. We understand why the treadmill is moving so fast. But we also saw, in the very beginning of our deep dive, how one individual investor managed to completely beat that system.
And they didn't do it by getting richer than everyone else.
They did it by stopping their moving goalpost, by finding genuine joy in low-cost activities, by hoarding cash, not to maximize spreadsheet returns, but to buy the psychological oxygen of independence. They recognized the treadmill for what it was, and they deliberately stepped off.
They chose to be psychologically happy rather than mathematically right. They consciously chose the simple grilled cheese over the exhausting 20-course tasting menu.
Exactly. And so we want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over, building on everything we have explored from these historical and personal sources. We now know with historical certainty that so much of our modern financial anxiety is inherited.
It is not a personal failure.
No, it is the ghost of a mid-century economic blip. the 1950s, that was historically unique, driven by the aftermath of a world war, and mathematically cannot be replicated today. Keeping Up with the Joneses is quite literally a game whose rules were designed in 1945, and if you play it today, you are mathematically destined to lose.
So if you know the game is rigged, if you know the treadmill is designed to break you, what does your personal declaration of independence look like? I want you to really think about this. What is the one financial expectation? Maybe it's a specific luxury car. Maybe it's the size of your house. Maybe it's a brand of clothing or the zip code you feel you need to live in. What is that one thing you are holding on to right now simply because society or a 75-year-old cultural echo told you that you were supposed to have it?
And what would happen to your life, to your peace of mind, if you just let it go?
It is the ultimate diagnostic question for your own life, and unlike the X-ray, you are the only one who can read the results.
It really is.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. It has been an absolute privilege unpacking this incredible blend of history and human psychology with you. Until next time, take care of yourselves, step off the treadmill for a bit, and take a much closer look at what you truly value.